Hello again. I hope you got a gist of what I was talking about earlier on in regard to the British context of youth work. The readings that I've given you this week will hopefully explore a little bit more. I basically in the last lecture skimmed across, I suppose, the general gist of where youth work evolved from in a British context. So I really do encourage you to read the handouts that I've attached this week, and that'll give you a lot more insight and depthness in regard to where youth work evolved from in Britain. So have a look at them, and hopefully they. And just a reminder as well to just keep trying to go back to those theories that we have looked at and that you have read about and that we talked about in the first few weeks, and see can you apply them or use them as a lens when you are looking at the British context and what's coming up for you, I suppose. And then hopefully you'll have questions when we're having tutorials. So this part of the lecture, we're going to look at the aim of this session is to look at the origins of youth work in Ireland. So again, you'll see some differences and you'll see some similarities in regard to British and Irish youth work. Both of them began from the same place essentially, and why that was, as some of us may know, is because obviously Ireland were under British rule until 1921, until we became our own state. So before then, the social professions, and Sarah Banks talks about this. If anyone is aware of Sarah Banks, she's written up, she's done a lot of writing on ethics in social work and social care, and she also has a publication which I plan to put up in later weeks called The Origins of the Social Professions, and it talks about the original social professions, where they came from. So exactly what I was talking about earlier in regard to that sort of middle class view of wanting to help and look after the working class and look after the poor. So from those origins in the mid to late 1800s came the professions of social work, community work and youth work. So Ireland was part of that, and then where we see the divergence and the differences coming about in a large part is after 1921 in Ireland, although obviously there's still influences and there's still similarities that can be joined up between the two countries. So Ireland in the 1850s to the 1900s, we had a rise of nationalism, which led to Ireland leaving Britain in 1921. So there was a big cultural revolution happening at the time, which a lot of Irish students would obviously be more aware of this. But we had our cultural revolution happening alongside our political revolution, and all this was happening, and you had people like W.B. Yeats creating his poetry, and we had drama and plays, and so so the cultural revolution went hand in hand with this political revolution that was happening at the time, because as we know that the arts and the drama and literature was a way of Irish people, and in particular, of course, as well, young Irish people trying to gain a vote, trying to gain a voice in what was happening. So you had Na Fianna Éireann, you had the GAA, so Na Fianna Éireann was political, the GAA, which was sports, and then the Gaelic League, okay, which emphasised and promoted the Irish language, Irish games, Irish, everything that was essentially Irish was promoted by the Gaelic League. So it was trying to bring back that sense of Irish identity and what it meant to be Irish, okay? So it was trying to counter that British influence that was predominant still at the time. So 1922, as we said, then 1922 to 1950, we had the emergence of the Irish state as Ireland left Britain and really went on that journey of trying to reiterate its own identity again. So with that, with looking at the Irish state, re-identifying itself and finding out where it was. Obviously, young people became a big part of that. So you had rural youth movements, such as what we know now as Muintir na Tíre, which was a very, and still is existing today for those of you who wouldn't be aware, particularly those of you who aren't Irish. Muintir na Tíre was an organisation for young people and predominantly young farmers, and is still thriving in Ireland to this day, along with Macra and the Tuatha, okay? So, which is now Feroga, which I look at again later on, but Feroga, which will be a national youth work organisation in Ireland at the moment, had its origins in that. So we had religious and uniformed movements. So you had, and again, this is very similar to a large extent to the path that Britain took. So you had the Catholic Boy Scouts, Catholic Girl Guides. You had the Catholic Youth Council, again, which was there for many years. You had the Legion of Mary, you had St. Vincent de Paul. So they were all running youth clubs for young people. So very involved organisations with young people. Again, we see very much the influence of the church, which is very much, again, the same as the British context, and trying to spread that word, trying to spread that mission, I suppose, of what it meant to be a good boy or a good girl in an Irish society, and that was took upon by the church at the time. Sorry there now. Sorry, I flicked ahead there. So, like I was saying, so you had very much sort of a diocesan basis of local youth services Ireland, so that they were set up by the church, they were set up by members of the church. They were, you know, very heavily influenced, like a lot of organisations at the time, and a lot of services working with people, the same with disability services, and any of the social care services at the time. So we still see that today in a lot of the places. They might necessarily be run by the church anymore, but they still have the name of the church. So maybe Brothers of Charity or Daughters of Charity, or for example. So moving on, so 1950 to 1970, we saw the development of national organisations. So we saw things like the National Federation of Youth Clubs set up, the National Youth Council, which is, and is still there today, which is a coordinating body for youth work in Ireland. And we saw the beginnings of state intervention. Okay, so the state started to take a hold as well. So it moved slightly. We obviously had a big influence from the church, but the state actually also started to play a part in providing youth services and coordinating youth services for young people in Ireland. So, but not as much as what we saw earlier on with in the British context, where the state youth services became predominantly state funded and state supported through the 1960s and the 1970s in Britain. During the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was still predominantly voluntary led and supported by charitable funds and by the church. So when the state got involved, which would have been predominantly the early 80s, we would have seen where it really people started to take note of the state getting involved. We had something called the Costello Report, which was the first real report which began to outline the need for, so a little bit like the Albemarle report in the British context, which started to outline the need for youth work services, and there to be support from the state for youth work services as well. So obviously this gave rise then to the need for policy formation at the time. So early policy rhetoric, like I said, 70s and the 80s. So the social education, it said what it was really saying was, at the time, the social education purpose of youth work was individualistic in its focus, rooted in a client-centred approach to young people, assuming the important outcome would be within the young person. And this is what this has been Hurley's critique of youth work policy at that time, that it dealt with sort of that client-centred view, assuming the important outcome would be within the young person. So very much this sort of self-development perspective and that very one-to-one, like that individual focus rather than a focus of the individual within the greater good. So very much a personal development mode of youth work was emphasised at this time, and the main policy concern was gaining recognition for youth work, establishing better provision for youth services. Okay, so we had the first state grant for youth work. So all this was happening in the 70s and the 80s in youth work, and it was gaining slight momentum. So like I said, the key report at the time would have been in 1983 with the Costello report. And from then, youth work began to gather slight momentum. Now, it wasn't for many years. It wasn't until into the 90s we really saw youth work becoming a profession in an Irish context, really the late 90s. But this was sort of the starting point when youth work at least begun to be recognised at a state level, and the need for there to be particular services, state-run services, for young people to be able to engage beyond what the church and volunteers were providing. So the 1980s, okay, so young people were viewed as citizens with rights capable of political and social analysis, and a grouping in society who were being discriminated against. Again, so they were seen as having an identity of their own, that they were a group, and how they were being defined. And you remember this there last week when we were looking at what is youth work. So that young people were seen as a particular group, and that they were seen as sort of maybe the troublemakers, or that they were labelled as such. So the individualist model of youth work was criticised as paternalistic. So that model that was being used in the 60s and 70s, where it was focusing on just the young person and developing that young person, was seen as individualistic. So keeping young people amongst the last important section of society to be essentially disenfranchised. So O'Farrell then, on the other hand, suggests that some people may have looked at these youth organisations not as supporting young people and developing young people, but maybe as organisations that were shaping young people to be a particular way, and could be seen also as agents of social control. But just to bear in mind, these are just perspectives on it, and I suppose when you have read the handouts that I've given you, you can formulate your own ideas on where you think youth work might have been in the 1980s and 1990s, and of course now using those sociological theories and lenses that we've talked about. So in the 1990s youth work, the purpose of youth work was understood in very narrow terms. So the development of the youth service structures and the sector, funding, structuring, access to social partnership, legislative basis, funding, professionalisation, recognition. So this was, I suppose, like we said, the golden era. So there was progress happening in the 1990s. It wasn't until the late 1990s and the early noughties that we saw plans and strategies coming to the fore, and Maurice Devlin talks about this in the handout that I've given you. But you had the Youth Work Development Plan 2003 to 2007, so that was even into the noughties. And before then, there was a number of things that happened, but didn't quite gather the same momentum as they did in the noughties. But they did. The 90s, I suppose, was when there was a bit of a push, and you did see youth workers being employed as professionals to do a professional youth work job, and that the purpose of youth work was beginning to open up into a better, people having a better understanding of it and what it was about. So, but as I said, I hope that the handouts that I give you will explain in a bit more depth. I'm just skimming over these just to give you a taster of really what those handouts talk about. So in the British context and in the Irish context. So, sorry, just to go back to this. So just have a think about Ireland and England. What were the similarities? So you could say that there was the church involvement, the religious involvement. They had the same origins. But I suppose one of the things that defined Ireland was that it was searching for its own identity as a country at the time that youth work came to the fore, and what were the sort of implications for their young people. and Britain very much had state support very early on. So have a look at the readings, and have a look at the quiz that I have there.